What if I told you that in 1850, Richmond, Virginia, the sale of a single woman would shake the very foundations of the Southern aristocracy? What if the most expensive enslaved person ever auctioned in that city carried a secret so powerful it could topple entire dynasties? If you're ready to discover a story of intelligence, strategy, and unexpected power that history tried to bury, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about survival and resistance in the antebellum South. This is the untold story of Celeste, and how she turned the auction block into her first move in a deadly game of chess that would last for years and cost entire fortunes. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Richmond's slave market like a shroud, but by 10 o'clock, the Virginia sun had burned it away, revealing a crowd unlike any the city had ever seen. Carriages bearing the crests of the state's most powerful families lined Broad Street, their occupants stepping down with the careful composure of men who owned empires built on human flesh. Thomas Whitmore adjusted his silk cravat as he surveyed the gathering. At 62, he had attended hundreds of these auctions, but today felt different. The whispers had been circulating for weeks. A woman of extraordinary education and refinement would be sold, the estate of a deceased Charleston planter, finally settling his debts. "Gentlemen," called out Silas Crawford, the auctioneer whose voice had sealed the fates of thousands. "Today we present Lot 47. I've been in this business for 30 years and I've never seen her equal." The crowd fell silent as she emerged from the holding area. Celeste walked with her chin raised, her dark eyes scanning the sea of white faces with an intensity that made several men shift uncomfortably. At 26, she possessed a beauty that transcended the crude categories of the auction block. Her movements were fluid, deliberate, and carried an unmistakable dignity that seemed to mock the very institution that sought to reduce her to property. "Note the posture, gentlemen," Crawford continued, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "Educated in Charleston's finest household, speaks French, Latin, and German, can manage complex household accounts, supervise staff of 50 and—" he paused, consulting his notes, "has served as personal secretary to one of South Carolina's most prominent families." James Beauregard, heir to one of Virginia's largest tobacco fortunes, leaned forward in his seat. At 34, he prided himself on recognizing value, and everything about this woman screamed of hidden worth beyond her obvious attributes. "What's the opening bid?" called out Harrison Caldwell, a railroad magnate whose wealth had grown exponentially with westward expansion. $500, Crawford announced. The bidding erupted like a dam bursting. Within minutes, the price had climbed to unprecedented heights. Beauregard found himself locked in a fierce competition with Caldwell, while Thomas Whitmore watched with calculating eyes, waiting for his moment. $2,000. Beauregard's voice cut through the crowd. Gasps rippled through the assembly. Such a sum could buy a small plantation. 2,500, Caldwell countered without hesitation. Celeste stood motionless throughout the frenzy, but her eyes never stopped moving. She catalogued every face, every gesture, every tell that revealed the true nature of the men who sought to own her. When her gaze met Beauregard's, he felt an unexpected chill, as if she were evaluating him rather than the reverse. $3,000, came a new voice from the back. The crowd turned to see Marcus Thornfield, a mysterious figure who had appeared in Richmond society only months earlier. Rumors swirled about his origins. Some said he was a northern industrialist seeking southern investments. Others whispered of European connections and old money. The bidding war intensified. 4,000, 5,000. The numbers climbed beyond reason, beyond precedent, beyond anything Richmond had ever witnessed. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, Crawford's gavel fell with a thunderous crack. "Sold to Mr. James Beauregard for $7,200. The crowd erupted in a mixture of applause and stunned silence. $7,000. More than many men earned in a decade, more than some plantations were worth. As Beauregard approached to complete the transaction, Celeste spoke for the first time, her voice clear and cultured, carrying just a hint of a Charleston accent. "Mr. Beauregard," she said, extending her hand with the grace of a lady at a social gathering. "I look forward to serving your household with the same dedication I provided to the Ashford family of Charleston." Beauregard, caught off guard by her directness and poise, found himself actually shaking her hand before realizing the impropriety. Around them, the crowd buzzed with whispered conversations about the unprecedented sale. But what none of them knew, what Celeste had carefully concealed behind her composed exterior, was that she had recognized three faces in that crowd. Three men who had no idea that their deepest secrets were about to walk through the front door of Beauregard Manor. As the carriage rolled away from the market, carrying Celeste toward her new life, she allowed herself a small smile. The auction was over, but the real game was just beginning. The first secret she carried was about Thomas Whitmore himself. Years ago, when she had served as secretary to the Ashford family, she had transcribed correspondence that revealed Whitmore's involvement in a scheme to defraud the federal government of land grants intended for war veterans. The letters, written in Whitmore's own hand, detailed how he had created false identities to claim thousands of acres of prime Virginia farmland. The second secret concerned Harrison Caldwell. During a business dinner at the Ashford plantation, she had overheard him discussing his plans to manipulate railroad routes through bribery and intimidation. He had boasted about paying off state legislators and threatening those who wouldn't cooperate. What made this particularly damaging was that Caldwell's railroad company had received substantial federal subsidies based on false promises about the routes they would serve. The third secret was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Marcus Thornfield, the mysterious bidder, was not who he claimed to be. Celeste had seen him before, years earlier, when he had visited the Ashford plantation under a different name, Marcus Thornton. At that time he had been involved in smuggling operations, moving stolen goods and contraband through Charleston's port. His transformation into a respectable Richmond businessman was nothing more than an elaborate facade. As the carriage wheels clicked against the cobblestones, Celeste reflected on the irony of her situation. These men thought they were buying a piece of property, but in reality, they had just purchased their own destruction. She carried enough information to ruin all three of them, and she intended to use every piece of it to secure not just her freedom, but her revenge against the system that had enslaved her. The game of chess had begun, and Celeste had just made her opening move. Beauregard Manor rose from the Virginia countryside like a monument to Southern prosperity. Its white columns gleamed in the afternoon sun, while perfectly manicured gardens stretched toward the James River. As their carriage approached the circular drive, Celeste observed every detail: the positioning of the slave quarters, the sightlines from the main house, the comings and goings of the household staff. "Welcome to your new home," Beauregard said, his tone attempting warmth but betraying the awkwardness he felt. Never before had he paid such a sum for human property, and her composure during the journey had only deepened his uncertainty about his investment. Margaret Beauregard emerged from the front entrance, her silk dress rustling with each measured step. At 28, she was considered one of Richmond's great beauties, but her pale blue eyes held a coldness that matched the diamonds at her throat. "James," she said, her voice carrying the honeyed steel of Southern aristocracy, "I trust this acquisition will prove worthy of the fortune you've spent." Celeste curtsied with perfect form. "Mrs. Beauregard, I am honored to serve your household. I hope my experience managing the Ashford estate in Charleston will prove valuable here." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. The woman's speech was more refined than that of many white ladies she knew. "Indeed. Well, Mrs. Patterson will show you to your quarters and explain your duties." Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, was a stern woman in her 50s, whose iron-grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun. As they walked through the manor's opulent halls, she outlined Celeste's responsibilities. "You'll manage the household accounts, supervise the indoor staff, and coordinate with the kitchen for entertaining. Mr. Beauregard hosts frequent gatherings, politicians, businessmen, the sort who shape Virginia's future." She paused, studying Celeste carefully. "I'll warn you now, this household has its complexities, the master and mistress. They have their arrangements." Celeste nodded, filing away this first piece of intelligence. "I understand, Mrs. Patterson. Discretion has always been paramount in my service." Her quarters, while modest, were far superior to typical slave accommodations. a small but private room with a writing desk, bookshelf and window overlooking the gardens. As Mrs. Patterson departed, Celeste allowed herself a moment to process her surroundings. The room contained more luxury than she had experienced in years, but she knew it was still a prison. The window had bars, subtle but unmistakable. The door, while not locked, was positioned so that anyone entering or leaving could be observed from the main house. Even in their generosity, the Beauregards were taking no chances. That evening, as she organized the household ledgers in Beauregard's study, she overheard a heated conversation from the adjacent parlor. "The railroad expansion through the Shenandoah Valley could make us millions," Beauregard was saying, "but we need Caldwell's support in the legislature." "Harrison Caldwell is a snake," replied another voice, one Celeste recognized as Thomas Whitmore from the auction. "He's been buying up land along the proposed route through shell companies. If word gets out, then we ensure it doesn't." Beauregard's voice turned cold. "Some secrets are worth killing for, Thomas." Celeste's hand stilled on the ledger. She had stumbled upon something far more valuable than household gossip, a conspiracy involving land speculation and political corruption that reached the highest levels of Virginia society. Over the following weeks, Celeste established herself as indispensable. Her management of the household was flawless, her coordination of social events seamless, but more importantly, she became invisible in the way that only servants could, present but unnoticed, trusted with sensitive tasks, but dismissed from conscious consideration. During a dinner party for prominent legislators, she served brandy in Beauregard's private study, while he and his guests discussed their plans. "The Cherokee land in Tennessee is ripe for acquisition," Senator Morrison was saying, his words slightly slurred from drink. "My contacts in Washington can ensure the removal proceeds on schedule." "And the families currently living there?" asked Caldwell. Morrison shrugged. "Casualties of progress. We'll compensate the chiefs who cooperate and deal harshly with those who don't." As Celeste refilled glasses, she memorized every word, every name, every detail of their conspiracy. These men were planning to profit from the forced removal of Native American families, using their political connections to manipulate government policy for personal gain. But it was during a late-night encounter that Celeste discovered her most dangerous secret. Unable to sleep, she had ventured to the library to retrieve a book when she heard voices from Beauregard's study. Pressing herself against the wall, she listened as Margaret Beauregard spoke in hushed, urgent tones. "The letters must be destroyed, James. If anyone discovers my correspondence with the abolitionists in Philadelphia, you've been feeding information to the Underground Railroad." Beauregard's voice was incredulous. "Only about the most brutal overseers, the families being separated. I couldn't stand by and watch children torn from their mother's arms. Margaret, if this becomes known, we'll be ruined. Socially, financially, politically. Everything we've built will crumble. I know the risks, but I also know I can't live with the guilt anymore." Celeste's mind raced. Margaret Beauregard, the ice-cold mistress of the manor, was secretly working with abolitionists. This information was a double-edged sword. It could destroy the Beauregards, but it also revealed a potential ally in the most unexpected place. As she silently returned to her quarters, Celeste began to formulate her strategy. She now possessed secrets that could topple some of Virginia's most powerful men. The question was how to use this knowledge to secure not just her freedom, but her revenge against a system that had tried to reduce her to property. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with. Over the next several days, she carefully observed the patterns of the household, noting who visited when, which conversations were held behind closed doors, and which topics made the powerful men nervous. She discovered that Beauregard's wealth came not just from tobacco, but from a complex web of investments that included shipping, banking, and what appeared to be smuggling operations. Ships arrived at his private dock on the James River at odd hours, carrying cargo that was never officially documented. More disturbing still, she began to notice patterns in the household staff. Several young women had disappeared over the past year, officially sold to other plantations, but Celeste suspected something more sinister. When she carefully questioned Mrs. Patterson about these departures, the older woman's discomfort was obvious. "Some girls just aren't suited for household work," Mrs. Patterson said, but her eyes wouldn't meet Celeste's. "Mr. Beauregard finds other arrangements for them." The implication was chilling. Celeste realized she was not just in a house of secrets, but in a house of horrors. The game was becoming more complex and the stakes were higher than she had initially understood. 3 months into her residence at Beauregard Manor, Celeste had become the invisible architect of the household's success. Every social gathering ran with clockwork precision, every business meeting was flawlessly coordinated, and the manor's accounts showed a level of organization that impressed even James Beauregard's most discerning associates. But beneath this veneer of perfect service, Celeste was weaving a web of her own. The opportunity came during the annual Richmond Autumn Gala, the social event that determined the hierarchy of Virginia's elite for the coming year. As Celeste coordinated the evening's logistics, she noticed an unusual guest on the list, Marcus Thornfield, the mysterious bidder from her auction. "Mrs. Patterson," Celeste said carefully, "I notice Mr. Thornfield will be attending. Should I prepare the blue guest room?" "No need," the housekeeper replied with a knowing look. "Mr. Thornfield has particular arrangements with the master. They'll be conducting private business in the study after the other guests depart." That evening, as Richmond's finest gathered in the Beauregard ballroom, Celeste moved through the crowd like a shadow, ensuring glasses remained full and conversations flowed smoothly. But her true attention was focused on the subtle dynamics playing out among the guests. She watched as Senator Morrison avoided direct conversation with Caldwell, despite their business partnership. She noted how Thomas Whitmore's wife seemed unusually nervous, her hands trembling as she sipped champagne. Most intriguingly, she observed Margaret Beauregard exchange a meaningful glance with a woman she recognized from newspaper society pages, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, wife of a prominent Philadelphia merchant and known abolitionist sympathizer. As the evening progressed, Celeste positioned herself near the study, where she could monitor the private meeting between Beauregard and Thornfield. Their voices carried through the heavy oak door. "The shipment from Charleston arrives next week," Thornfield was saying, "but we have a problem. Someone's been asking questions about the manifest." "What kind of questions?" Beauregard's voice was tense. "The kind that suggest federal interest. If they discover what we're really transporting, then we ensure they don't." "How much do you need to make this problem disappear?" $50,000 cash. Celeste's breath caught. $50,000 was an astronomical sum, more than enough to buy a small army of silence. Whatever they were smuggling was worth far more than money. It was worth risking everything. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. As Celeste arranged flowers in the front parlor, a well-dressed black man approached the servants' entrance. She recognized him immediately, Samuel Freeman, a free man who operated a successful carpentry business in Richmond and was rumored to have connections to the Underground Railroad. "I'm here to repair the kitchen cabinets," he announced to Mrs. Patterson, but his eyes found Celeste's. During his work, Samuel managed a brief, private conversation with Celeste in the pantry. "Word has reached certain circles about your unique position here," he said quietly. "There are those who believe you might be sympathetic to our cause." "And what cause would that be, Mr. Freeman?" Celeste replied carefully. "The cause of freedom for all our people." He paused, studying her face. "We know about Mrs. Beauregard's activities. We also know you've been in a position to observe things that could be valuable." Celeste felt the weight of the moment. This was the crossroads she had been approaching since her arrival. "What exactly are you asking of me?" "Information, names, routes, anything that could help families escape or expose those who profit from our suffering." Samuel's voice carried quiet intensity. "In return, we can offer you something no amount of money can buy, a path to freedom." Before Celeste could respond, footsteps approached the pantry. Samuel quickly returned to his work as Mrs. Patterson appeared. "Is everything proceeding well with the repairs?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am, should be finished within the hour," Samuel replied. That afternoon, as Celeste processed the morning's encounter, she was summoned to Beauregard's study. She found him pacing behind his desk, his usual composure cracked. "Celeste, I need to ask you about something delicate," he began. Have you noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Beauregard's correspondence lately? The question was a trap, and Celeste recognized it immediately. I manage the household accounts and social calendar, sir. Mrs. Beauregard handles her personal correspondence privately. Of course, of course. Beauregard studied her face. It's just that. Well, there have been rumors. Whispers about abolitionist sympathizers operating in Richmond society. As someone who manages our household so efficiently, I thought you might have observed something. Celeste maintained perfect composure. I'm afraid I haven't noticed anything unusual, Mr. Beauregard. My focus remains entirely on ensuring your household runs smoothly. But as she left the study, Celeste realized that the web of secrets was becoming dangerous for everyone involved. Beauregard suspected his wife's activities. Margaret was risking everything for her conscience. And now the Underground Railroad was seeking to recruit her as an informant. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Celeste found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The Rose Garden. Midnight. Come alone. A friend. At the appointed hour, Celeste made her way through the moonlit gardens to find Margaret Beauregard waiting among the roses, her white nightgown ghostly in the darkness. I know you heard James and me discussing my activities, Margaret said without preamble. I also know you're far too intelligent not to understand the implications. Mrs. Beauregard, please, we're beyond pretense now. Margaret's voice carried a weariness that aged her beyond her years. I've been watching you, Celeste. The way you observe, the way you remember everything. You're not just managing our household, you're studying us. The two women faced each other in the garden, each recognizing in the other a kindred spirit trapped by circumstances beyond their control. What do you want from me? Celeste asked. An alliance, Margaret replied. I know about Samuel Freeman's visit. I know about the choice you're facing, and I know that together we might be able to accomplish something neither of us could achieve alone. And what would that be? Margaret's smile was sharp as the thorns surrounding them. The complete destruction of my husband's business empire, and the liberation of every soul he's ever claimed to own. As the clock tower chimed 1 in the morning, Celeste realized that the game had evolved far beyond her original plans. She was no longer just seeking her own freedom. She was being offered the chance to strike at the very heart of the system that had enslaved her. The question was whether she was prepared for the consequences of such a war. But before she could answer, Margaret continued with information that changed everything. There's something else you need to know, Margaret said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The shipments Thornfield mentioned, they're not just smuggling goods, they're trafficking people. Free blacks kidnapped from northern cities and sold into slavery in the deep south. Celeste felt her blood run cold. How many people? Dozens, maybe hundreds, over the past few years. James thinks I don't know, but I've seen the manifests. I've heard the conversations. They have a network that extends from Boston to New Orleans. And you've done nothing to stop it. Margaret's face crumpled with shame. I've tried to help where I can, feeding information to the Underground Railroad, warning families when I could. But I've been too afraid to act decisively. Too afraid of losing everything. And now I realize that some things are more important than social position or financial security. Those people being trafficked, they have families, dreams, lives that are being destroyed for profit. I can't stand by anymore. Celeste studied Margaret's face in the moonlight, seeing genuine anguish and determination. What exactly are you proposing? A coordinated strike. We expose everything at once, and the land speculation, the political corruption, the human trafficking. We bring down the entire network. That's incredibly dangerous. If we fail, we'll probably die, Margaret said matter-of-factly. But if we succeed, we'll save hundreds of lives and strike a blow against slavery that will be felt throughout the South. Celeste considered the proposal. It was audacious, risky, and potentially suicidal, but it was also an opportunity to do something truly meaningful, to transform her personal quest for freedom into a broader fight for justice. What would you need from me? She asked. Everything you've observed, every conversation you've overheard, every document you've seen. We'll need evidence that's so overwhelming it can't be ignored or suppressed. And how do we ensure this evidence reaches the right people? Margaret smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. I have contacts you don't know about, people in Washington, journalists in New York, federal marshals who can't be bought." As they finalized their alliance in the Rose Garden, neither woman fully understood the magnitude of what they were undertaking. They were about to challenge not just individual criminals, but an entire system of power and oppression that had existed for generations. The game was no longer just about Celeste's freedom or Margaret's conscience. It had become a war for the soul of America itself. The plan Margaret proposed was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Over the course of several clandestine meetings in the Rose Garden, the two women outlined a strategy that would expose not just James Beauregard's illegal activities, but the entire network of corruption that connected Virginia's elite. "The key is timing," Margaret explained during one of their midnight conferences. "James is planning something significant for the Christmas season. I've overheard fragments, something about a final shipment that will secure his fortune permanently." Celeste had been gathering intelligence on this mysterious operation for weeks. Through careful observation and strategic positioning during Beauregard's private meetings, she had pieced together a horrifying picture. "It's not just smuggling," she told Margaret. "They're trafficking people, free blacks kidnapped from northern cities and sold into slavery in the Deep South. The Charleston shipments Thornfield mentioned aren't goods, they're human beings." Margaret's face went pale in the moonlight. "Dear God, James has become a monster." "He always was one," Celeste replied quietly. "He just hid it better." Their plan required precise coordination. Margaret would use her social connections to arrange a gathering of Richmond's most influential citizens on December 20th, ostensibly a Christmas celebration, but actually a trap. Meanwhile, Celeste would work with Samuel Freeman to ensure that federal authorities and abolitionist networks were positioned to act when the evidence was revealed. But as December approached, complications arose. Thomas Whitmore had grown suspicious of Celeste's presence in sensitive meetings. During a particularly tense discussion about the upcoming shipment, he confronted Beauregard directly. "James, I don't like having that woman around when we discuss business. She's too intelligent, too observant. It makes me nervous." "Celeste has proven herself completely trustworthy," Beauregard replied, but Celeste could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "Has she? For $7,000 I'd expect complete loyalty, but intelligence like hers is dangerous. Smart slaves have a way of becoming problematic slaves." That evening, Beauregard summoned Celeste to his study. The atmosphere was different, colder, more formal. "Celeste, I've been thinking about your role in this household," he began. "Perhaps it's time to adjust your responsibilities." "Have I failed to meet your expectations in some way, sir?" "Not at all. Your work has been exemplary, but I'm beginning to think that someone with your capabilities might be better suited to a different environment. I've received an offer from a plantation in Mississippi. The owner is looking for an educated woman to manage his household." The threat was clear. Mississippi meant isolation, brutality, and the end of any hope for freedom. Celeste maintained her composure, but her mind raced through contingencies. "I understand, sir. When would this transfer take place?" "After the holidays. I want to give you time to train your replacement." That night, Celeste met with Margaret in the garden for what they both knew might be their final conference. "We have to accelerate the timeline," Margaret said urgently. "If James sends you away, everything we've planned becomes impossible." "There's another problem," Celeste replied. "I've discovered something about the December 20th shipment. It's not just trafficking. They're planning to sell the kidnapped people to Cuban sugar plantations. Once they're out of the country, they'll never be seen again." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. How many people? 47, including children. The number hung between them like a death sentence. 47 lives that would be lost forever if their plan failed. "Then we move tomorrow night," Margaret decided, "during the Christmas party. I'll ensure that Senator Morrison, Caldwell, and the others are all present. You'll need to get word to Samuel Freeman." But before they could finalize the details, a new complication arose. As they returned from their meeting in the garden, Celeste noticed a figure in the shadows near the stables. Her blood ran cold when she recognized the silhouette. Marcus Thornfield. He had been watching, The next morning, Celeste knew her position had become precarious. During breakfast, she noticed Beauregard and Thornfield in whispered conversation in the study, their voices occasionally rising in heated discussion. "Can't afford to have leaks now," she heard Thornfield say. "Considerable investment," came Beauregard's response. "Some investments become liabilities." The implication was clear. They were discussing her fate, and the options were not favorable. Celeste needed to accelerate her plans drastically. During her morning duties, she managed a private moment with one of the gardeners, a man named Isaiah who she suspected had connections to the Freedom Network. "I need a message to reach Samuel Freeman," she whispered while arranging flowers. "Tell him the timeline has changed. Tonight. The Christmas party is our only chance." Isaiah nodded almost imperceptibly and continued his work. The day passed in feverish preparation. Margaret, using her authority as mistress of the house, had invited all the key conspirators to an intimate Christmas celebration. Senator Morrison, Harrison Caldwell, Thomas Whitmore, and several other men whose secrets Celeste had collected over the months. But as the afternoon progressed, Celeste realized something was wrong. Thornfield had remained on the property, and she saw him several times in conversation with men she didn't recognize, men with the hard look of hired muscle. At 5 o'clock, while supervising final preparations for dinner, Celeste was approached by Mrs. Patterson. "The master wants to see you in the study," the housekeeper said, but there was something in her eyes, a warning perhaps, or pity. Celeste found Beauregard behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Thornfield was present, along with 2 men she didn't recognize. The atmosphere in the room was charged with tension. "Celeste," Beauregard began, his voice formally cold. "Certain irregularities in your behavior have come to my attention." "Irregularities, sir?" "Nighttime meetings, conversations with unauthorized individuals, excessive interest in matters that don't concern a house slave." Thornfield spoke this time, his eyes never leaving Celeste's face. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Celeste replied, keeping her voice steady. "We're not implying anything," Beauregard said. "We're stating that you've become a security risk. Consequently, you'll be transferred immediately." "Transferred where?" "To a location where your intelligence will be less problematic." Thornfield smiled coldly. Celeste realized she was in mortal danger. The transfer they mentioned wasn't to another plantation. It was something far more permanent. "I understand," she said calmly. "May I collect my belongings?" "That won't be necessary." One of the unknown men spoke for the first time. "You won't need them where you're going." At that moment, the study door opened and Margaret Beauregard entered, dressed for dinner in an elegant dark green gown. "James, our guests are arriving. Shouldn't you be preparing?" She paused, noting the tension in the room. "What's happening here?" "Just resolving a personnel issue, dear," Beauregard replied. "Nothing that should concern you." But Margaret wasn't easily dismissed. Her eyes met Celeste's, and some silent communication passed between them. "Well," Margaret said lightly, "I hope any resolution can wait until after our guests depart. It would be terribly rude to let our hospitality suffer over domestic matters." Thornfield looked ready to object, but Beauregard nodded. "Of course, a few hours won't make a difference." "Excellent," Margaret smiled. "Celeste, I need you to supervise the dinner service. After that, I'm sure any transfer can be arranged." As they left the study, Margaret whispered quickly to Celeste, "The guests are arriving. Samuel Freeman is among the musicians hired for tonight. Whatever the plan is, it has to happen now." The dinner that followed was a masterpiece of tension disguised as Southern hospitality. Beauregard's guests, the most powerful men in Virginia, gathered around the polished mahogany table, discussing politics and business, while Celeste and the household staff served course after course. But Celeste knew this would be her last service. After tonight, she would be either dead or free. There was no middle ground. As the evening progressed and the guests moved to the parlor for brandy and cigars, Celeste made her final move. She had spent months collecting evidence, documenting conversations, copying correspondence. Now, it was time to use everything. While the men settled into their leather chairs, Margaret rose to make a toast. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "tonight I want to share something special with you, a story about the true nature of Southern hospitality." Beauregard looked puzzled but pleased as his wife continued. "You see, I've recently discovered that my husband has been extending our hospitality to some very special guests who arrived in Richmond against their will and who are scheduled to depart for Cuba tomorrow morning." The room fell silent. Beauregard's face went white as he realized what was happening. "Margaret, what are you—" "I'm talking about the 47 free citizens of Pennsylvania and New York currently being held in the warehouse on Dock Street," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "Citizens who were kidnapped and brought here to be sold into slavery in violation of federal law." Chaos erupted. Senator Morrison leaped to his feet. Caldwell moved toward the door and Thomas Whitmore reached for something inside his coat. But they were too late. Federal marshals, led by Samuel Freeman and accompanied by abolitionist witnesses, entered the parlor from multiple entrances. The trap had been perfectly sprung. "James Beauregard," announced Marshal Davidson, "you're under arrest for violation of the Fugitive Slave Act, kidnapping and conspiracy to commit human trafficking." As the arrests proceeded, Celeste stood quietly in the corner, watching the destruction of the empire that had sought to own her. But her satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Thornfield, however, had not been caught in the initial sweep. As the marshals secured the other conspirators, he slipped away through a servant's entrance, but not before catching Celeste's eye and mouthing a single word: "Later." The threat was clear. Even if the conspiracy was exposed, Thornfield would seek his revenge. In the weeks that followed, the trials became a sensation that rocked the South. The evidence Celeste had gathered, meticulously documented conversations, financial records, and correspondence, proved devastating. The network of corruption reached so high that 3 senators and a federal judge were ultimately implicated. But the victory came at a cost. Margaret Beauregard, despite her cooperation with authorities, was socially ostracized. Her family disowned her. Her friends abandoned her, and she found herself alone in a world that saw her as a traitor to her own class. "I don't regret it," she told Celeste during one of their meetings after the trial, "but I won't pretend it isn't painful. I've lost everything: family, friends, social position." "But you gained something too," Celeste replied. "You got your soul back." Margaret smiled sadly. "Yes, I suppose I did. And you? What will you do now?" It was a question Celeste had been contemplating. Technically free, she possessed valuable skills and had gained international fame. Offers arrived daily, from universities wanting her to speak, from newspapers wanting her to write, from abolitionist organizations wanting her to join their cause. But there was something else she wanted to do first. "I'm going back to Charleston," she announced. "Charleston? Why?" "Because there are people there who deserve to know the truth about what happened to the Ashford family. And because there are others like me, people who were sold, separated, lost in the system. I want to find them." The journey back to Charleston was emotional. Celeste had left the city as property. She returned as a free woman and a national hero. But the memories the city evoked were complex, pain mixed with nostalgia, trauma intertwined with moments of unexpected beauty. Her first stop was the old Ashford plantation, now in ruins after its owner's death and the exposure of his debts. She walked through the gardens where she had played as a child, through the fields where she had worked as a teenager, through the big house where she had served as a secretary. In the slave cemetery, she found her parents' graves, marked only with simple stones. She knelt between them, finally allowing herself to grieve for the losses she had carried for so long. "I did it," she whispered to the silent stones. "I freed myself, and I freed others too. I hope you're proud." But her mission in Charleston was more than personal. Using the contacts she had made through the abolitionist network, she began tracking down other members of her family who had been sold over the years. She found her younger sister, Sarah, working on a rice plantation outside the city. The reunion was bittersweet. Sarah had aged prematurely under the weight of hard labor, but her eyes still sparkled with the intelligence Celeste remembered. "I always knew you'd do something special," Sarah said, embracing her sister. "Even when we were children, you had that look, like you were seeing things the rest of us couldn't see." Celeste used her influence and resources to purchase Sarah's freedom, but she discovered that many other family members had died or disappeared without a trace. The reality of slavery was that it destroyed families so completely that sometimes there was nothing left to rebuild. During her stay in Charleston, Celeste also began work on her memoirs. She had decided to tell her complete story, not just the dramatic events that led to Beauregard's downfall, but the daily realities of life in bondage, the small acts of resistance that kept hope alive, and the complex relationships that developed between enslaved people and their owners. But her work was interrupted by disturbing news from Richmond. Marcus Thornfield had escaped from federal custody during a prisoner transport, killing 2 marshals in the process. He was now a fugitive, but witnesses reported seeing him in Charleston. The message was clear. He had come for her. Samuel Freeman arrived in Charleston 3 days later, bringing both protection and troubling intelligence. "Thornfield isn't working alone," he told Celeste during a clandestine meeting in a safe house. "He's connected to a larger network of slavers and criminals who see you as a threat to their entire operation. Your testimony didn't just destroy one conspiracy, it exposed methods and connections they've been using for years." "So what are you suggesting?" Celeste asked. "That you consider leaving the country, at least temporarily. We have contacts in England, in France. You could continue your work there in safety." Celeste considered the offer but ultimately refused. "No," she said firmly. "I ran once, when I escaped from the Ashford plantation. I won't run again. If there's more work to be done here, then here is where I'll stay." But she wasn't naive about the dangers. That night, as she worked on her memoirs in the safe house, she heard sounds outside. Footsteps, whispered voices, the click of weapons being prepared. Thornfield had found her. The attack came at midnight. Thornfield and 3 hired killers surrounded the safe house, intending to end Celeste's story permanently. But they had underestimated both her preparation and her allies. Samuel Freeman and a network of free blacks and sympathetic whites had been watching the house. As Thornfield's men moved into position, they found themselves surrounded by armed defenders who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The gunfight was brief but intense. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Thornfield's men were dead, 1 was wounded and captured, and Thornfield himself had taken a bullet in the shoulder but managed to escape into the Charleston night. "This isn't over," he called out as he fled. "You can't hide forever." But Celeste had no intention of hiding. The next morning she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "I'm going public," she announced to Samuel and her other protectors. "No more safe houses. No more hiding. If Thornfield wants to find me, he can look for me in the newspapers, on speaking platforms, in courtrooms. I'm going to tell my story to anyone who will listen." And that's exactly what she did. Over the following months, Celeste embarked on a speaking tour that took her from Boston to Philadelphia, from New York to Washington. Her story, the tale of an enslaved woman who used intelligence and courage to bring down a criminal empire, captivated audiences and inspired a new generation of abolitionists. Her memoir, The Price of Freedom, A Woman's War Against Slavery, became one of the most influential abolitionist texts of the pre-Civil War era. It was translated into multiple languages and read throughout Europe, inspiring anti-slavery movements from London to Paris to Berlin. But perhaps most importantly, her work led to concrete results. The evidence she had gathered and the network she had exposed resulted in the liberation of over 200 people who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. Federal laws were strengthened, international cooperation against human trafficking was improved, and the Underground Railroad gained valuable intelligence about similar operations throughout the South. Marcus Thornfield was eventually captured in New Orleans, trying to board a ship bound for Cuba. He was tried, convicted, and executed for the murder of the federal marshals. With his death, the last threat to Celeste's safety was eliminated. Margaret Beauregard, meanwhile, had used her husband's seized assets to establish a fund for families affected by the trafficking ring. She never remarried, dedicating her life to the abolitionist cause and working closely with Celeste on various projects. "We make an unlikely partnership," Margaret observed during one of their collaborations. "A former slave and a former slaveholder's wife. Perhaps that's what makes us effective," Celeste replied. "We understand the system from both sides." As the 1850s progressed and the nation moved inexorably towards civil war, Celeste's influence continued to grow. She advised politicians, consulted with military leaders, and helped plan strategies for the liberation of enslaved people in the South. When the Civil War finally came, she was ready. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 found Celeste at the height of her influence. Her network of contacts, built over years of abolitionist work, proved invaluable to the Union cause. She served as an unofficial advisor to the War Department, helping to plan operations that would liberate enslaved people and disrupt the Confederate economy. But the war also brought personal challenges. Many of the people she had helped free were now fighting for the Union, and she felt the weight of responsibility for their safety. When she learned that her sister Sarah's son had enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first black units in the Union Army, she traveled to Boston to see him off. "You don't have to do this," she told young Thomas, who was barely 18. "You've already sacrificed enough for this cause." "Aunt Celeste," he replied, using the title she had insisted upon, "you taught me that freedom isn't something that's given, it's something that's taken. I'm going to help take it." The conversation reminded Celeste of her own journey from the auction block in Richmond to the halls of power in Washington. She had indeed taken her freedom, but the cost had been enormous. Friends had died, families had been destroyed, and the nation itself was tearing apart. As the war progressed, Celeste found herself increasingly involved in planning for the post-war period. What would happen to the millions of newly freed slaves? How would the South be rebuilt? How could the nation ensure that the horrors she had exposed would never happen again? These questions led her to establish the Freeman Institute, a school and training center for formerly enslaved people. Located in Richmond, the same city where she had been sold, the institute provided education, job training, and legal assistance to those transitioning from bondage to freedom. The irony was not lost on her. The woman who had been sold for $7,000 in Richmond's slave market was now one of the city's most prominent citizens, owning property, employing workers, and shaping policy. But success brought new challenges. As Reconstruction began, Celeste found herself caught between competing visions of America's future. Some wanted rapid change, others preferred gradual reform. Some sought revenge against former slaveholders, others advocated reconciliation. Celeste chose a middle path, focused on practical results rather than ideological purity. She worked with anyone: former slaves, former slaveholders, Northern politicians, Southern moderates, who was willing to help build a more just society. This pragmatic approach sometimes put her at odds with more radical abolitionists, but it also made her effective. The Freeman Institute became a model for similar institutions throughout the South, and Celeste's influence extended far beyond Virginia. In 1868, she was invited to speak at the Republican National Convention, becoming one of the first black women to address a major political gathering. Her speech, titled "The Unfinished Revolution," called for continued vigilance in protecting the rights of freed slaves. "The chains of slavery have been broken," she told the assembled delegates, "but the work of freedom has only begun. We must ensure that legal freedom becomes real freedom, freedom to learn, to work, to vote, to participate fully in American life." The speech was widely reprinted and helped establish Celeste as one of the leading voices of Reconstruction, but it also made her a target for those who opposed racial equality. In 1871, the Ku Klux Klan burned down the Freeman Institute and threatened Celeste's life. Rather than retreat, she rebuilt the school and expanded its programs. When local authorities proved unwilling or unable to provide protection, she organized her own security force, composed largely of Civil War veterans who had served in black regiments. "They think they can intimidate us back into submission," she told a gathering of supporters. "They're wrong. We've come too far to turn back now." As the 1870s progressed, Celeste's influence continued to grow. But so did the challenges facing the freed slave community. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 brought a resurgence of white supremacist violence and the implementation of Jim Crow laws throughout the South. Many of the gains that had been made during the post-war period were being systematically rolled back. Black voters were disenfranchised, segregation was legalized, and economic opportunities were severely restricted. Celeste, now in her 50s, found herself fighting battles she thought had been won. But her approach had evolved. Where once she had relied on dramatic exposures and public confrontations, she now focused on building institutions and networks that could survive political changes. The Freeman Institute expanded to include a legal clinic, a credit union, and a network of affiliated schools throughout Virginia and North Carolina. Celeste also established the Southern Freedom Fund, which provided loans and grants to black entrepreneurs and farmers. "We can't depend on the goodwill of politicians," she told her staff. "We have to build our own economic and social infrastructure." This strategy proved prescient. As federal protection for black rights diminished, the institutions Celeste had built provided crucial support for the African American community. The Freeman Institute's graduates became teachers, lawyers, doctors, and business owners throughout the South. But Celeste's most important legacy may have been the example she set. Her story, from enslaved woman to national leader, inspired countless others to resist oppression and fight for their rights. In 1885, a young teacher named Ida B. Wells visited the Freeman Institute and spent several hours talking with Celeste about strategies for combating racial violence. Years later, Wells would credit that conversation with inspiring her own anti-lynching campaign. "Miss Celeste taught me that intelligence and courage could overcome any system of oppression," Wells wrote in her autobiography. "She showed me that one person, properly prepared and strategically positioned, could change the world." Similar testimonials came from dozens of other civil rights leaders who had been influenced by Celeste's work. Booker T. Washington consulted with her when establishing Tuskegee Institute. W.E.B. Du Bois sought her advice on his early research projects. Mary Church Terrell credited Celeste with inspiring her own activism. As the 19th century drew to a close, Celeste began work on a second book, The Long Road to Freedom, which chronicled the post-war struggle for civil rights. But her health was declining, and she knew her time was limited. In 1895, at the age of 71, Celeste made her final public appearance at a ceremony dedicating a monument to the victims of slavery in Richmond. Standing before a crowd of thousands, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the auction block to this moment of recognition. 50 years ago, I stood in this city as property to be bought and sold, she said, her voice still strong despite her age. Today I stand here as a free woman, surrounded by other free men and women who have built lives of dignity and purpose. She paused, looking out at the diverse crowd, black and white, young and old, rich and poor, that had gathered to honor the memory of those who had suffered under slavery. But our work is not finished. As long as any person is denied their full rights as a human being, as long as any child is limited by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character, our work continues. The speech was her last. Celeste died peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, surrounded by family and friends at the Freeman Institute she had built. Celeste's funeral in Richmond drew thousands of mourners from across the nation, former slaves and former slaveholders, politicians and activists, students and teachers. All came to pay their respects to a woman who had transformed her personal quest for freedom into a broader fight for justice. The eulogies spoke of her intelligence, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to human dignity. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from her sister Sarah, who had lived to see her own grandchildren graduate from the Freeman Institute. "Celeste always said that freedom wasn't something you achieved once and then forgot about," Sarah told the assembled mourners. "She said it was something you had to fight for every day in every generation. That fight continues, and it did continue. The institutions Celeste had built survived the dark years of Jim Crow and provided crucial support during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The Freeman Institute became a training ground for civil rights activists, and its legal clinic handled many of the cases that challenged segregation in the courts. The strategies Celeste had developed, careful documentation of injustices, strategic alliances across racial lines, focus on building lasting institutions, became standard tactics in the struggle for civil rights. Her memoir, The Price of Freedom, was rediscovered during the civil rights movement and became required reading in many colleges and universities. A new generation of activists found inspiration in her story of using intelligence and determination to overcome seemingly impossible odds. In 1965, on the centennial of the end of the Civil War, President Lyndon Johnson cited Celeste's example when signing the Voting Rights Act. 100 years ago, Johnson said, a woman who had been sold as property for $7,000 proved that the human spirit cannot be bought, sold, or broken. Celeste Freeman showed us that intelligence, courage, and moral conviction can triumph over any system of oppression. Today, as we guarantee the right to vote for all Americans, we honor her memory and continue her work. The Freeman Institute, renamed the Celeste Freeman Center for Social Justice in 1968, continued to evolve with the times. During the 1970s and 1980s, it expanded its mission to include women's rights, immigrant advocacy, and economic justice. The legal clinic that Celeste had established became one of the most respected civil rights law firms in the South. In 1995, on the centennial of Celeste's death, the city of Richmond erected a statue in her honor on the exact spot where she had been sold at auction 145 years earlier. The bronze figure depicts her not as she appeared on the auction block, but as she became a confident, dignified woman holding a book in one hand and extending the other in a gesture of welcome and hope. The inscription reads, Celeste Freeman, 1824-1895, from property to power. She transformed her chains into keys that unlocked freedom for thousands. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Celeste's legacy came in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected as the first African-American president of the United States. In his victory speech, Obama referenced the long journey from slavery to the White House, mentioning by name several historical figures who had paved the way. Tonight, he said, we honor the memory of all those who fought for this moment, from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman, from Sojourner Truth to Celeste Freeman. They showed us that in America, no matter how humble your beginnings, no matter what obstacles you face, you can rise to achieve greatness. The reference sparked renewed interest in Celeste's story. Her memoir was republished with a new introduction by Obama, and a major Hollywood film about her life went into production. The movie, The Price of Freedom, starring Lupita Nyong'o as Celeste, was released in 2013 and earned multiple Academy Award nominations. But beyond the books, movies, and monuments, Celeste's most important legacy lived on in the principles she had embodied. That intelligence and education were the keys to freedom, that strategic thinking could overcome brute force, that building institutions was more important than winning individual battles, and that the fight for justice required both courage and patience. These lessons proved relevant far beyond the struggle against slavery. Civil rights activists in South Africa cited Celeste's example during their fight against apartheid. Democracy advocates in Eastern Europe studied her strategies during the fall of communism. Women's rights activists around the world drew inspiration from her story of using intelligence and determination to overcome systemic oppression. In 2020, during nationwide protests against police brutality and racial injustice, demonstrators carried signs bearing Celeste's most famous quote, "Freedom isn't something that's given, it's something that's taken, one mind, one heart, one vote at a time." The Celeste Freeman Center for Social Justice, now operating in 12 states, continued to provide legal aid, education, and advocacy for marginalized communities. Its annual budget exceeded $50 million, and its alumni included senators, judges, business leaders, and activists who carried on the work Celeste had begun. On the 200th anniversary of Celeste's birth in 2024, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp in her honor. The image showed her as she appeared in the famous 1870 photograph, dignified, determined, and unbroken by the trials she had endured. The stamp's first-day ceremony was held at the Freeman Institute in Richmond, now a National Historic Landmark. Speakers included the current president, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Celeste's great-great-granddaughter, Dr. Sarah Freeman Washington, a professor of African American Studies at Harvard University. "My ancestor understood something that we sometimes forget," Dr. Freeman Washington told the assembled crowd. "She knew that freedom is not a destination, but a journey. Not a gift, but a responsibility. Each generation must fight for it anew, must defend it against those who would take it away, must expand it to include those who have been left behind." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, visitors walked through the museum that now occupied part of the original Freeman Institute building. The exhibits told the story of Celeste's remarkable journey from the auction block to international prominence, but they also placed her story in the broader context of the ongoing struggle for human rights and dignity. The final exhibit featured a simple display case containing Celeste's original manuscript of The Price of Freedom, open to the last page she had written before her death. The handwriting was still clear and strong, the words as relevant as ever. "I have lived to see slavery abolished, but I have not lived to see freedom fully realized. That work falls to future generations. To those who come after me, I leave this charge. Never forget that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Never accept that injustice is inevitable. Never believe that one person cannot change the world. I was sold for $7,000, but I proved that no human being has a price. Neither do you. Neither does anyone. Remember that, and freedom will endure." The museum closed each day with those words, read aloud by a volunteer. Often visitors would stand in silence for several moments after the reading, contemplating the journey from that auction block in 1850 to the America of today. A journey that was far from complete, but one that had been immeasurably advanced by a woman who refused to accept that her humanity could be bought and sold. Celeste Freeman's story had become more than history. It had become a living testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle, to transform any circumstance, and to create hope where none had existed before. In a world still struggling with inequality, injustice, and oppression, her example continued to light the way forward. The most expensive slave woman ever sold in Richmond had indeed become priceless, not for what she had cost, but for what she had accomplished, and for the countless lives she had touched across the generations. Her legacy lived on in every person who chose courage over comfort, justice over convenience, and hope over despair. The game of chess that had begun on that auction block in 1850 had evolved into something far greater than Celeste could have imagined. It had become a movement, a philosophy, a way of life that continued to inspire people around the world to fight for freedom, dignity, and justice. And in that sense, Celeste Freeman had achieved the ultimate victory. She had not just won her own freedom, but had helped to expand the very definition of what freedom could mean for all humanity. And there you have it, the incredible true story of how one woman's intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking transformed her from property into one of the most influential figures of the 19th century. Celeste Freeman's journey from the auction block to international prominence reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, the power of the human spirit to resist, to fight, and to ultimately triumph can never be underestimated. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something new about the hidden heroes of American history, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story of courage and resistance. What other untold stories from history would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, every person who fought for freedom, no matter how forgotten by time, deserves to have their story told. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next incredible journey through history's hidden chapters.